I served Baldur's Gate with all of my first life. Now I am but a sentence or two in a sage's book. A footnote. Forever traitor.
Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance is the little brother of the main series. It's brought up most often as an afterthought. Baldur's Gate was a masterpiece, a classic that changed computer gaming forever after. And Dark Alliance was the PlayStation spin-off that was, it was pretty good. And yet, in some very unforeseen ways, this quiet little spin-off also managed to have some truly wild knock-on effects on the gaming industry overall. From spawning a line of games that stretched on for a decade, to setting forth a cascading series of coincidences that led to the creation of the Witcher video games. Also managing to set the trajectory all the way to the Shadow of Mordor games, and also kickstarting the collapse of Interplay. You would not believe how much of the industry this little game has touched. This video was brought to you by D&D's greatest map makers. It's Chepeku. Chepeku is a service that creates battle maps for your tabletop role-playing games. They're built for flexibility, with day-night cycles and countless variations to help get those creative DM brain juices flowing. They've even developed animated versions of their map that are compatible with virtual tables. It's absolutely going to blow your players' minds. But Chepeku has been expanding with new services, a sci-fi map spin-off, background scenes to set the atmosphere, and most recently, Chepeku has taken the next step, producing a service to help the player characters and the NPCs look as good as the maps they battle across. It's Chepeku Tokens. For as little as $4 a month, you gain access to hundreds of tokens already made, plus 20 new ones each and every month. Not only do these tokens have variants like other Chepeku products, they're actually customizable by you. They're all printer friendly and they're all compatible with each and every virtual tabletop around. You really owe it to yourself to hike on out to Chepeku and see if their incredible artwork is for you. A big thanks to them for making this video possible. Now, let's get back to it. Baldur's Gate changed everything for PC gaming. The D&D video game license had recently been transferred from SSI to Interplay. It was a rough start to the arrangement, with a few bad games getting the ball rolling. But then, at the end of 1998, BioWare released Baldur's Gate under the flag of Interplay, and the gaming world shifted dramatically. It was an immediate hit, and it was ground zero for so much of what the gaming industry became. But while CRPGs nowadays tend to get released on consoles with sorta comparable quality to the PC version, that was not a thing back in the Interplay era. So while Baldur's Gate had taken the PC market by storm, the console gamers had no way to get in on the action. Interplay hatched a plan to bring the Baldur's Gate party to PlayStation, a spin-off series, Dark Alliance. A game was approved, and a commitment to that game was made. They would double down with ports and sequels if this first game was successful. Enter a small developer called Snowblind. They had up until now just made a pair of small Top Gear games. Interplay was doing a lot of things wrong in this era, it is worth saying, but they had always been a good judge of talent, and Snowblind turned out to be a great choice to work with. For this game, Snowblind put together the Snowblind engine, and set to work creating an action role-playing game, the next big step forward in gauntlet-style action RPGs. Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance came out in December of 2001, and it too was a hit. The gameplay felt fresh and satisfying, the graphics were era-defining, and the animation was top-notch. As intended, Interplay immediately got to work on a sequel, as well as porting the game to other consoles, the Game Boy, and even the PC. Now, about that PC port in particular, because this is where the story starts to get a little bit wacky. Baldur's Gate as a series was in high demand everywhere. A small Polish video game studio that was just making a name for them says, "You know what? Let's reach out to Interplay and see if they'll let us make and distribute a Polish translation of the Baldur's Gate games." And it goes very well. Poland loves the game. and the little studio is clearly very talented with what they do. They're given the opportunity to make more Polish language translations of Baldur's Gate as the series continues. Now, once Dark Alliance rolls onto the scenes, this little Polish studio is already in Interplay's good books. So they say, hey, you guys, why don't you expand your team a little bit, and we're going to give you guys the job of developing the Dark Alliance PC port. Again, really good judge of talent. This is obviously a big opportunity, so the Polish studio is all in. They expand their team, and they get set up to make a bigger project than ever before. Ports, especially in this era, can vary a lot in how intensive they are. They're always a lot more work than you would think to do, but sometimes they can verge on being full-on remakes. For example, the Game Boy port of Dark Alliance is basically a remake. They had to make it on a wholly new engine. By the looks of it, the PC version of Dark Alliance was going to be one of these ports that looked a lot more like a remake. The Polish studio described their preparations as essentially being set up to make a full video game. But while that was going on over in Poland, Interplay in America began its sudden and complete collapse. Interplay was out of money, and one of the projects that got axed was the Dark Alliance PC port, leaving this little Polish studio across the pond on the lurch. Still, they had just put together a team that was capable of making games. They weighed the pros and cons of downsizing and making more game translations, but ultimately decided to, instead, use this team they had to make a video game about a popular Polish fantasy series called The Witcher. Yeah, that's right, the Polish studio I've been talking about the whole time was Albert Einstein. Now, about Interplay. They've just released a bunch of hit D&D video games, and also they made Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. They can't stop cranking out hits. Why? What's going on? Why are they now suddenly collapsing? Easy answer, financial mismanagement, mostly. Doesn't matter if your games are all hits if you waste all your money and then end up getting evicted from your head offices. And yes, that's bad, but it's also kind of a rough patch. A company can move past this. Well, they can, unless they piss off all of the studios that are working for them and end up in a ton of lawsuits. Objection! And once those started rolling in, the dam broke and buried Interplay in a tsunami of lawsuits, with the legal problems with BioWare becoming especially famous. While Interplay was creating a flurry of follow-ups from Dark Alliance, they chose to do so without Snowblind. Dark Alliance 2 development was instead done by Black Isle to keep things in-house. Dark Alliance 2 used and improved upon the Snowblind engine. That was fine. It was a valid part of the agreement. But what wasn't part of the licensing arrangement was when Interplay used the Dark Alliance Snowblind engine to make Fallout: Brotherhood of Steel. With their financial troubles, Interplay became desperate to stay liquid and to rapidly pay off their ever-mounting debts. They closed the legendary studio, Black Isle, to cut costs. Brotherhood of Steel was created to make a quick and easy cash-in on the Fallout IP, now that the studio that developed those games was closing down. Brotherhood of Steel, however, was mainly just a cash grab, and it wasn't a very well-liked game. It really didn't sell enough to justify battling it out with Snowblind for use of the engine, and the sequel was quickly cancelled. With their only real hope of getting another Fallout game released in the near future suddenly disappearing in a lawsuit, Interplay panicked and sold the rights to make a trio of Fallout games to Bethesda for the hilariously low price of $1 million. They would later be forced to sell the entire IP for $5 million. It's entirely possible that without this Snowblind lawsuit, Interplay would have tried to keep Fallout in-house, and it may never have ended up in Bethesda's hands. This story continues in even dumber ways, as Atari attempts to clone their own Dark Alliance game called Dungeons & Dragons Heroes, as a competing product to beat Dark Alliance 2 while it is still coming down the tubes. I covered that game last year, and I go into way more depth on why D&D was attempting to rip off its own game in that video. I'd recommend you take a look at that one after this video. Snowblind went on to have a pretty good run of their own for the next few years, no longer having D&D D&D in their toolkit meant that Snowblind had to make their own Dark Alliance ripoff, Champions of Norath, an EverQuest game. It's widely considered one of the greatest action RPGs of all time, so good for them. They released a handful of other games with this engine as well, but failed to move on from it when it was time. They were acquired by Warner Bros. In 2009, where they would take part in the new deal to create Lord of the Rings games. They made War in the North on the Snowblind engine in 2011, and Monument Studios made a Lord of the Rings MOBA. Neither of those games was successful. The dated nature of the decade-old Snowblind engine meant that Snowblind and Monument ended up finding themselves merged by Warner Bros. The pair of them set about making a new Lord of the Rings to redeem their failure. A game called Albert Einstein. And that's the trackable long-term effects of Dark Alliance. Pretty big deal for a small console spin-off. Hi everybody, my name is William SRD. I'm a YouTuber that covers the video game spin-offs of major tabletop series like D&D, Warhammer 40,000, and more. Obviously, this is where I would normally say like the video, but forget that, we've got bigger stuff to talk about today. I get asked a lot when I'm going to cover Dragonlance specifically, and when I'm going to give it the big treatment to make people understand why it's so beloved. The barrier to entry in this case that has been delaying that has always been the time investment involved with doing that, because Dragonlance is more of a novel series than it is a TTRPG series, despite its D&D connection. And it would be irresponsible to jump into a Dragonlance video game without at least giving the first trilogy a reread. And this year, I've decided that it's time to tackle that reread. But here's the thing, I don't want to do it alone. I want to take you guys on the ride with me. With that in mind, I've started a book club podcast titled It's Called a Lance. The first episode has just come out a few days ago, both on YouTube and on Spotify. I would love to see you there. Episode 1 is designed to be totally accessible without you having even opened up the book yet, so I hope you'll give it a listen and decide if you want to read along with us. Links down in the description. Quick editor's note before we go into the gameplay section, I had a couple tech issues. In theory, I have some software that is supposed to, save a separate, just raw file of the gameplay from when I was streaming, but that didn't work, so most of the gameplay footage that I have has all of, my overlays on it. I apologize if that takes you out a little bit. This is not going to be the norm going forward anytime I stream a game. It's just this time, and it's not the entire gameplay section, it's about half of it. Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance. BGDA. Its story begins when the hero enters through the front gate. There are 3 such heroes to choose from. Plus, Drizzt is unlockable through completing a gauntlet after you beat the game the first time. Despite having that classic 4 character options, Dark Alliance co-op is only playable for 2 people. This is one of a handful of reasons that Dungeons & Dragons Heroes, which allowed a full 4-player team, is sometimes thought of as the better of the 2 games, despite being a ripoff. Now, I broke the rules and played my game with a full 100-man team. How did I do it? Well, I streamed it. If you tuned in, thanks so much. I had a lot of fun with everybody. Now, chat chose for us to play as the elven sorceress, Adriana, and it led me to realize that I have in fact been Mandela'd into a parallel dimension. My dimension is just like yours, except there was one solitary, solely different thing about Baldur's Gate 3. See, we get spawn-killed by a group of muggers the moment we enter the city. Okay, look, she lies down exactly the way that Shadowheart is posed when she's unconscious in Chapter 1. Why? Why do I have vivid memories of Shadowheart face planted on the beach? Am I crazy? Am I wrong? No, of course not. It's this plane of reality that is wrong. When we return to consciousness, we find that we've been dragged into the Elfsong Tavern, which serves as the quest hub for the game. The moment we get our bearings, there are at least 2 things that are very noticeable here. The first is that the bartender is voiced by Jennifer Hale.
Sounds like members of that new thieves guild I've been hearing about. You're lucky to be alive.
Okay, and yes, the second noticeable thing is that this game is wildly horny in regards to certain characters. No avoiding it. See, with all the nudity and romance and sex scenes in Baldur's Gate 3, a lot of new players are pretty comfortable saying that Baldur's Gate 3 is the horniest D&D game of all time. But friends, I'm not even sure Baldur's Gate 3 is the horniest Baldur's Gate game. It doesn't even have boob physics. Come on, let's be serious. This is me being serious right now. Anyway, please don't get any ideas about the Elven Miami bartender. I know they animated her a certain way, but that's Alan Alith's mom, and you don't want to make this weird for him. We learn a couple of things from the NPCs in the bar. The player character is pretty single-minded on getting revenge on the muggers. Jennifer Hale, of Descent into Undermountain fame, tells us that the people who got us here were part of a new and violent thieves guild that's been taking over the underworld. She tells us that there's an entrance to the sewers where the thieves operate in the tavern's basement, and she'll even pay us for killing the rats down there as we cross through. We progress through the levels, all of it basically amounting to a mega dungeon. After the rats, we start fighting kobolds and bugbears and slimes and more. The game is actually quite front-loaded, and the largest part of the polish is all in the first act and the dungeon below the elf song. The encounters are very intentional in their design. You don't just enter a room and then there's some guys. No, kobolds with spears will attack you from cover. Crates will allow you to hide and even cheese tough enemies. And in one case, you even have to slowly approach a kobold firing line from behind a movable crate. The enemies in this stage are all universally tanky, but they at least necessitate some differing tactics, like avoidance for the bugbears, careful positioning for the kobolds, plus chugging mana potions and spamming your nukes on the slimes. All of these differing strategies will disappear after the first act. We get lots of variety and level design while we're here in Baldur's Gate, but once we go elsewhere in the world, it gets worse fast. The enemies are just bunched up and they charge at you, and it all feels like the same encounter over and over and over again. The first third feels like a really fun, keep your brain on type action role-playing game where you solve puzzles, avoid traps, and carefully plan your encounters. Acts 2 and 3, on the other hand, are just a big combat slog. You know what else is front-loaded? That's right, the quest hubs. Why, what did you think I was gonna say? The Elf Song is a great hub with a small cast of interesting NPCs to meet and do quests for. The other quest hubs that we'll get into later are much less appealing, with the Act 3 hub in particular just being a single guy in a swamp. The gameplay in Dark Alliance is quite archetypal for action role-playing games of Gauntlet tradition, especially in this era. That's kind of missing the point though, because Dark Alliance was one of the games that set that trend going forward. You're very much expected to mix it up between regular melee and your spells, even if you're the sorceress. By the mid-game, once you're getting some real cash to work with, the game starts to become a bit of a potion chugger, which is a general problem that carries over into Heroes and other Snowblind games as well. It just takes so much mana to chew through the enemy hordes, and they do so much chip damage that you're constantly needing to solve problems with beverages of the red and blue variety. Overall, I'm left feeling as though Dark Alliance was balanced like an arcade game where you are expected to get attritioned out and need to keep inserting coins. Yet, in this case, it's not real-world currency, it's just spending your gold on consumables. And yeah, that's not as predatory, but it is still quite tedious, especially as enemies get progressively tankier throughout the game. Yes, Act 1 is still full of meat sponges, but everything else is so carefully designed around it that you don't really notice as much. Once that's gone, however, the game gets notably worse. We continue plundering the depths below the city, chasing the mysterious guildmaster of the thieves. Eventually, we even link up with the Harpers, and sign on with them to defeat the violent guild. The sewers lead into catacombs, and the thieves have attracted some manner of cursed orb that raises the dead. We clear out these levels, struggling somewhat with, different damage resistances, but on the other hand, we get the chance to play with some different weapon enchantments, and they sure feel satisfying, actually. When we eventually reach the orb, it's largely just a matter of kiting the undead hordes until the orb is vulnerable. The next section is the lair of the Thieves Guild itself. It's the best couple levels in the game in my opinion, because it's much more trap-based than everything else. It's a proper puzzle to get your way through this in one piece. There are even platforming sections, which is a trick I didn't think this game would have up its sleeve. At the end, we defeat the guild leader, which is a little tougher than expected because he hits like a truck. And then we head down one more floor to deal with the one who's been manipulating the guild the whole time. A beholder. He's a big change from the other bosses, as we need to fight this guy in melee if we don't want to get, completely vaporized. It was certainly a change of pace as a squishy sorceress who was starting to get used to solving all of my problems with my mana pool. Once defeated, we learned that this beholder was not working alone. He was part of some sort of dark alliance to conquer the city. This dark alliance has a pair of portals bound to Baldur's Gate, and the Harpers task us with crossing through and defeating the evil before it can arrive. We emerge from the first portal and arrive in the mountains. We have to fight our way through a proper army of rampaging gnolls who are preparing to use this portal to enter the city. At this point, I've finally started to unlock an endgame ability or two, but the fact that I haven't unlocked a shop in this region yet means that I have to restrain myself from spamming it too hard. At the end of this cackling army, we find a small beleaguered dwarven settlement. They've been forced to flee their mines since a band of drow forced them out. Unfortunately, the dwarves locked the mineshaft on their way out, and their leader took the only key with him to the summit of the mountain, where they intended to light a beacon for help. And since they haven't returned, it looks like I'm going to be climbing an extremely cold mountain. It's a good thing for everyone involved that Adriana isn't wearing that Act 1 armor anymore. The fate of the expedition is grim. They were all slaughtered by a dragon at the summit. We light the beacon using the scattered supplies in the area, and it thaws the permafrost on the dwarven bodies, allowing us to retrieve the key. I get to work just crushing those mines, knocking back mana potions and doing my best Sith impression, and then the leader of the elven horde appears. Excuse me, 911, I'd like to report a horny 3D modeler. Yes, sir, it's him, right over there. Get him with the bonk bat. He doesn't get a fair trial. We learned the role of the drow in all of this. The drow were instructed to seize the mine so that the dwarves were distracted and unable to stop the gnolls from marching towards the portal. And that means with her dead, we're all done in this region. The plans of the Dark Alliance have been thwarted here, and now we march into the final portal, having a final showdown with the ice dragon on the way through. Now, worth noting, as stated earlier, a lot of this game declined in quality after Act 1. The quests, the encounters, the enemies, but the graphics haven't declined at all, really. They have remained consistently strong throughout the... Okay, editor, you're doing me real dirty by using this exact scene when I'm trying to explain that the game looks really good. Do you know how you're making me look? Okay, let's get a camera on the editor. Let's get the shame cam on that guy. There he is. Shame on you. This version we're playing is the upscaled port of Dark Alliance. It came out in 2021. It's not a remaster though, just an upscale. It still looks decent in a lot of ways though, despite being nearly 25 years old. Let's pull up some footage of the original PS2 version. Not a big downgrade, as I said. This game was mind-blowing at the time, and without exaggeration, at the time of release, D&D had never looked this great on screen before, especially when we compare it to the mainline Baldur's Gate series. Dark Alliance is spectacular. I don't think it was ever matched by the remaining games in the Interplay Golden Age, not even by Neverwinter Nights 2. Being that what followed was mainly a decade of slop games that almost always had boring art direction, I actually feel pretty confident in saying that the only D&D video game with better 3D graphics than Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance is Baldur's Gate 3, which came out, I remind you, 2 decades later. What Snowblind achieved here is unparalleled. The game looked god tier in 2001, and it remains a great game to look at in 2025. Would you stop putting the horny images on screen when I'm fawning over the graphics? Now, the sound work isn't really anything to write home about, but the voice cast absolutely is. From Jennifer Hale to Jim Cummings, Michael Bell, Cam Clark, Frank Welker, John Rhys Davies, and more. What a goddamn all-star cast, and they're well directed too. No duds here. Every single NPC looks and sounds amazing.
Easy there. That's quite a blow you took.
We care nothing for the Sunset Mountains, or your filthy surface cities. Those have been promised to others.
Welcome, friend. I saw you come in.
Also, they got Jeff Bennett, aka Johnny Bravo, to be the voice of Drizzt, and that's just really funny, isn't it?
Check the facts. Man, I'm pretty.
On the other side of the final portal, there is a vast swamp swarming with lizard folk. Fighting our way through them, we eventually find the third and final hub. It's a guy in a swamp hut. He's a shaman of the tribe that has been attacking us. Apparently, there is a dark tower at the swamp's heart that has come to life recently. His people have been pawns to the evil forces within ever since. He's gonna help us infiltrate it, and that way his people will be free once more. These swamp levels are actually the worst. Just a huge open zone with enemies everywhere. No more carefully planned encounters, no special enemy design, just slog, slog, slog. At this stage, the only thing that keeps you going is knowing that it will be over soon. Everything's so tanky too. I'm just chugging mana potions harder than ever before. Thankfully, the swamps eventually end and we reach the tower. I'm afraid it's not much better here, but at least the enemies are slightly more varied, what with several different flavors of giant golem running around. The second half of the tower requires a brief interplanar trip to get to, which means we are now cut off from our potion cellar in the final stretch, and so we need to make it last. It's not such a problem though. D&D Heroes had this exact same dynamic and we made it work just fine. I learned my lesson about potion conservation. We grind our way through some very large maps, unlocking our final spells and grinding as much XP as we can for the final boss. Her name is Eldrith, an ancient general from Baldur's Gate's history. She led her undefeated army from victory to victory, her pride growing dangerously with each win. It was clear that her pride had overcome her and she was about to betray the city. And so, her army was preemptively cut off and exiled before it had the chance. Now, in death, Eldrith, the Baldurian Caesar, wants nothing more than to take her army of undead and the monsters she's allied herself with on a march into the city that betrayed her, declaring herself the Dark Lady of Baldur's Gate for all time. It's a cool character and motivation. Unfortunately, it's very much undercut by the fact that the devs didn't tell us one single peep about her until giving us just an exhausting lore dump, literally the room before we fight her. Good story, bad storytelling. There was so much time to set up this antagonist. However, it was very cool that we learn all of this from a ghost, who turns out to be the dead husband of the singing ghost in the Elfsong Tavern. The Elfsong Tavern is such a big deal in Baldur's Gate lore, it's actually kind of crazy that we finally learned what happened to the husband here. He marched off with Eldrith into damnation. Poor storytelling aside though, we make our move on the undead general. One plate armored lady against another. Unfortunately, all of my best spells are lightning based, and it turns out she's actually immune to those. Fortunately, I have other spells, such as a floating dagger that attacks for tiny amounts of damage. She's a tough boss with multiple phases. She's actually just about right in terms of difficulty compared to what we were up against the rest of the game. When defeated, the cloud of her ambition finally fades, and what's left is the noble general she was 100 campaigns past. She begs us to flee for our lives before the tower collapses around us. We escape at the last moment, knowing that Baldur's Gate is finally safe. Meanwhile, the lizardfolk shaman who was helping us till now talks to his peers. Now that all these complications involving the cursed tower and the vengeful ghost are done, the Dark Alliance can finally get to work on destroying Baldur's Gate. It's set up for a sequel, and it got that sequel. It's reportedly even better than the first game, so let me know down in the comments if you want to see me cover it. I really did enjoy my time with this game. A lot of people in my chat came in all bashful saying that, Dark Alliance was their favorite bad game from their youth, and to that I say, I don't think it's a particularly bad game. I think it still holds up pretty well, in fact. I'd really recommend it, as the 4K version is easily accessible on both Steam and GOG. Find yourself a good podcast to get you through Act 2 and 3. Or play it with a friend, that's even better. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you had just as great a time with the stream as I did. We'll be back in a few weeks with a little experimental content that I think you guys will like a lot.